Welcome to another episode of the City as a School podcast. We're here with an unplugged session with Andrew. Andrew, how are you doing?
I am great. It's always a pleasure to be able to chat with you about education because I know we have a lot of shared passion there. And I'm excited about what we're going to talk about today, especially.
Nice. We're going to be chatting about the pre-conquest consciousness thread that you've just posted. Do you want to pull it up and give some more context for people before
Yeah.
we start jamming on it?
Yeah. First, let me just give a basic kind of overview of where my head's at and why I'm thinking about this. So my first child's on the way, and so I'll be a father to a daughter. And I'm thinking about how I should relate to this being, basically. Like, what is the healthy way for parents to relate to their children and to teach their children? I want to homeschool. I have the aspirations to homeschool. I'd be happy to do other solutions too. I think there are a lot of successful ways to parent, but I'm very excited about the idea of like unblocking my child consistently because when I was going through school, I felt stunted and blocked and held back so often. That was very frustrating. But I think to get there, which like people really want to jump to curriculum. It's like, well,
Right.
what should be their first math class and what should be their first reading class and how do you teach them to read? And it's very like mechanics oriented, but all those mechanics have to exist inside a communication medium. So first, like, how will you communicate with your child? What sort of eye contact should you use? How should you dance with them? Should you sing to them? Should you sing with them? Like, and there are all these kind of social behavioral, cultural questions that have to precede any of our curriculum questions. So that's the context. And then I read this essay, which was very inspirational in this regard, called Pre-Conquest Consciousness.
And there's a big part of this, which is also kind of shifting the focus away from not just curriculum and also away from the learner specifically, but actually back to yourself as the parent, right? Like you need to become a better, different person to bring this human into the world. And I find that to be
Yes.
fascinating. So let's get into it.
Yes, exactly. Or at least to make sure that that human feels healthy and happy.
Mhm.
To give somebody a happy home, basically. And what is a home is kind of its own interesting question that I think is explored in this essay, because clearly a home isn't all physical environment. Home
Mhm.
has a lot to do with the relationships that exist in that place of being. So this is the essay Pre-Conquest Consciousness by Richard Sorensen, who is an anthropologist. And the idea of a pre-conquest civilization or pre-conquest society is often a tribal society that has never been colonized before. So it never met with the Romans or the Indics or the Cynic conquest or any of these major civilizations that popped up across Asia, Europe, and
Mhm.
the Mediterranean. So I wrote a thread that was summarizing this piece.
Shout out to the fractal university classes, which are also dropping. Go sign up for those.
True. Okay, so I basically wrote a thread with just my highlights of this so that we can kind of get to the core point, which is this to me is an essay that very much is about the communication styles and the cultural mediums that are good for human happiness, human playfulness,
Right.
human joy, and seem to create these kind of miracles of joy and flourishing. There are clear critiques that you could make of these cultures, but that's not really the point. The point is to take their best ideas. And obviously, one of the main critiques is that a lot of these cultures got colonized. So, like, you could say that they didn't have sufficient defenses against like other cultural viruses, so to speak, or whatever. And but again, I don't want to talk about that. That's not particularly important. I want to talk about their virtues. So here is where it started for me, and the reason I liked it. Pre-conquest groups are simultaneously individualistic and collective. So this is already an interesting idea. I think in the West, we kind of have this dualism going on of individualism and collectivism that is actually false dichotomy. And one of the first things the author points out is the false dichotomy here that says, like, in fact, individualism and collectivism are not distinct. They exist as part of a individualistic unity, which he brings up. An individualistic, unified at oneness. So
Mm.
he especially talks about the boys in the tribe. During adolescence, their rapport intensified. A rapid flow of synchronous regard began uniting them even more closely as they scattered through the forest, each constantly enlivening the others by a ceaseless, spirited, individualistic input into a unified at oneness. And I find this exceptional. If all boys were like this in the West, people would see our education system as the most successful in the world, I think, overnight. Each constantly
Where does this
enlivening the
get
others by a ceaseless, spirited, individualistic input. It's very, very powerful, if true.
It's super powerful, and I can like attest to seeing this in, my family are Malanao, which is a tribe in Borneo. They unfortunately not pre-conquest. There's been plenty of imperialism after that, but I'm curious, like, where you see this being shut down. Some boys can. I feel like at a young enough age in the West, boys can find this. They can be like this. Where does this start to get shut down in like Western cultures?
So actually, I think this is one of the main points of this essay that I want to kind of keep coming back to, and which is covered a little bit later here in this body language section. So then I'll answer your question by first sharing this body language idea.
Go for it.
So it's saying, as detailed above, sociosensual child nurture spawned body language based on tactile exchanges of affect. Infants were quick to notice that the happiness of others made their own lives happier and richer, so they responded accordingly. They realized that the more accurately and fully they conveyed their inner needs and interests, the more quickly rewarding responses were forthcoming. So they displayed their true feelings without artifice, as open and clearly as their tiny frames permitted. The more skilled they were at conveying their feelings, the happier they were. Indeed, the happier were all. Therefore, tactile talk, in other words, touch, was affect talk, in other words, emotional truth speaking. And affect talk was truth talk, because the best way to state things about the truth of you as a being is to state your emotions clearly. And it was so compelling that even after learning verbal speech, children continued bouncing inner passions back and forth in affect talk. The messages were more emotionally rewarding. They moved more quickly and more accurately and were usually more deeply evocative. Spoken words did not have the same instant sensuality and were thus more remote from lives sentiently focused. Affect talk was truth talk because it only worked when personal feelings were above board and accurately expressed, which required transparency in aspirations, interests, and desires. So to answer your question of like, where does this go wrong? In the boys up above, why is it that in the West, maybe it's uncommon to see people constantly enlivening each other? I think it goes down somewhere where tactile talk ends, which often I think is as soon as the child is born, ironically. Right. The moment the child is born, if your child's taken from you and you're not touching them, I don't think that causes permanent trauma or anything, but I think it is representative of a culture or a cultural pattern of like caring for your child as if it were a machine rather than caring for your child as if it was a gooey emotional psyche that needs constant touch and communication as data inputs. So if you think of your baby as more of like this data processing human that is like constantly trying to seek feedback about the world, you could think of one of the highest bandwidth places for them to receive that feedback as like touching their parents, literally like in physical skin to skin contact with their parents, because they get all this information about their parents' internal state. They can hear their parents' heartbeat. They can feel how warm their parents are. They can feel their parents' hands and all of the tactile sensations that go with the hands. So I basically think that if kids don't learn that from their parents, then they don't do it with each other. And if they don't do it with each other, they aren't able to be transparent about their aspirations, interests, and desires, kind of like what it was saying down below. And if you aren't able to be transparent in your aspirations, interests, and desires, then there's no way to enliven each other, because to what direction or toward what end would you be enlivening? So instead, I think people kind of get frustrated and almost like have emotional outburst, like they have the occasional emotional outburst rather than having the constant emotional connection.
And that's connected to, there's a second point you have right under here, which I think is super powerful, is the tactile talk equals affect talk equals truth talk, because the emotions are on the surface, which equals happy talk. You need to establish this baseline, basically, is what you're saying. And like as of communicating through tactile talk. Yeah, keep going in through the
yeah. So basically the idea here is that, and I'll go back to like what the boys are able to accomplish when this gets pushed through into adolescence. There is a richness, expressiveness, emotionality to human life, to all human life. And we see it in art, we see it in movies, we see it in love, we see it in lovemaking. There is this richness, expressiveness, and emotionality exists. And infants are capable of picking up on it, but they need a medium of communication. And that richness, expressiveness, emotionality, when people are embedded in that, they tend to be very happy. It's like, you might even think to yourself, oh, some of my happiest moments in my life are watching like the best movie I've ever watched or reading the best book I've ever read. And part of that, I think, is because you're connected emotionally to life, really. And so that's kind of where it starts. And then that's an endless positive feedback loop, right? Where like the more I communicate with you about the richness of life, the more you're able to communicate with me about the richness that you're experiencing. And then we can kind of continuously give this feedback, and we're always in a good, happy moment. And whenever negative feelings start to arise, they can actually be communicated instantly via
Right.
touch or via affect talk. And those negative emotions likely can be eased out by the society or by the culture or by the parent or by the little tribe if it's adolescence. And so in that way, there are less negative emotional outbursts that happen. So that's where it
Mhm.
starts. And then, you know, how do we know that this is actually effective is something I want to talk about. Another way of describing this kind of unity is guileless, hypersensual interactive unity. By the way, I just really like that expression, guileless as in without deception, and interactive as in playful back and forth. But basically when these adolescents in this pre-conquest tribe met another tribe that didn't speak the same language as them in the middle of the forest, which you can imagine is a terrifying environment because both groups had bows and arrows. So two tribes of adolescent boys with weapons who don't speak the same language and who are in many ways territorial, kind of for obvious reasons, because they need to defend themselves in case of, you know, bad agents or bad actors, and who are capable of hunting. These are boys who hunt. And they meet each other, and what happens? So despite a gaping language barrier, amity broke out. They compared bows and arrows and then food. They examined each other's different kinds of dress. They improvised. They spent the night close to one another in the for sensual style. And by morning, they were bosom buddies, as in they would hug and touch a lot.
Mhm.
And presumably were very affect oriented toward each other. And these are total strangers. At first light, they were up and out along the ridge on a hunt together. They showed off their different hunting styles. When they separated to go back home, they made a date to meet at the same shelter at the next full moon. Following the second meeting, two younger Awa boys, entranced by the prowess of their stronger new four friends, returned to stay with them in their hamlet for several days. So like there was an exchange of people, literally. Then two four boys went off to the Awa hamlet. Then those two gangs became good friends. They created a settlement together, which became a location of trade between these two tribes. Then
Mhm.
there was deep cultural communication between the two tribes. They developed shared language. And then soon everybody was speaking a four Awa blend in that hamlet, and a new village was established between these two tribes that was actually a genetic blend of the two tribes as well.
Amazing.
So I think what is powerful about that sentiment is this idea that like adolescent boys are capable of this,
Mhm.
but only capable in the world where they're able to establish a guileless, hypersensual, interactive unity with strangers. And I think that that is far and beyond the capabilities of Western boys in a very interesting way. And Western boys have different capabilities that these people don't have. So I'm not trying to say one's better or worse. That's not the point. We just want to focus on the strengths. The ability to meet strangers who have weapons and to turn them into your best friends, and to such a degree that you're able to create a shared tribe, marriages, trade, and like a unity between two entire peoples is just inside of all adolescent boys by nature. I don't think these were exceptional cases,
Yeah.
basically.
Like the powerful, like there's a certain way you could be overly romantic about this and say like, oh, well, in the past, this was, this is something that, pre-modernity we've lost and we should go back to. I think it's just still there, right? Like that's all there. All that powerful capability and possibility is there with every young boy. It's
Yeah.
just very powerful to think that trade and new relationships, new language sharing can happen just because of this touch talk, truth talk, which is
And
going on.
yeah, and of course it's there because, I even mentioned here, it reminds me a lot of Visa, who is kind of doing this,
Yeah.
but in the internet, basically. And
Hmm.
so I think one research question that comes out of this is how can you do affect talk is truth talk? Clearly you can't do tactile talk, but how do you do affect talk is truth talk, is happiness talk, but on Twitter? And
Hmm.
I think there are people that are inventing this, like Visa, who talk about good reply game. And
Hmm.
the whole idea is about creating a guileless, hypersensual interactive unity, but through words on the internet rather than
Right.
through physical touch. It's obviously a harder challenge, but there are people doing it. I think it's possible. Yeah. Anyway, names were improvised. It was not too important. Getting angry. So this is one interesting one. Getting angry among confreres, so getting angry among friends in the tribe or among tribe members, was like one hand getting angry with the other. It just doesn't make sense to them in a lot of ways. So they were not accustomed to full-blown expressions of negative emotions. When they were confronted with our photographs, like Western photographs of full-blown anger, maybe like a boss yelling at coworkers or a dad yelling at kids, many were stunned, frightened, and disoriented. even in photographs not intended to show anger, they sometimes notice subtle traces that are so common in the West that they're not even considered anger there. But they had other reasons to be frightened of negative emotions. They had no formal social structure, therefore no stable social safety net to hold them all together when affect rapport gave way. When it did, and in the times of trouble, they were bereft, existentially desolated. So there's a little bit of the negative going on here that like it's just too much to try to get into of like how do societies crumble and stuff. I find it very interesting, this idea that when confronted with our photographs of full-blown anger, they were like frightened, disoriented, and stunned, literally. Like they almost were shocked that anybody could ever get to that angry of a place or that negative or dark of a place.
Right.
And I think that's because like in their kind of constant affect rapport society, anger just melts before it can build into an outburst.
There's so many events for it, and it's just a common part of living. I wonder what the like. We don't want to get too much into the rest of the thread because that's about like how the society's collapsed. You know, for you as a parent to be, and for parents currently with young humans, what is there that we can take away from this?
It's a great question, and I think I'm still thinking and still processing, because obviously you need to socialize your child to society and you don't want them to be like totally dependent on you. Like I cannot in fact form a affect rapport tribe that is purely improvisational and purely play based.
Sure.
And so you need to try your best to separate out, well, what here is like a universal truth that could exist in any culture and what is kind of specific to a culture that's so improvisational. And my belief, my strong belief, is that way more of it is universal than you might first suspect. And that's because I've met people like you or Visa, or I've met so many people now in my life who clearly just immediately are able to establish affect rapport.
Right.
Through even text on the internet. It's insane. So for me, I think the main takeaway as a parent to be is like, it's so much more important that I establish affect rapport with my child that is always present. That is ever present. And that if it breaks, I ever, due to my actions or due to my child's actions, well, due to my child's actions, it's like a relationship. It's always mutual.
Yeah.
So if it ever breaks, if the relationship ever breaks and affect rapport is lost, that I do what it takes to reestablish it immediately or as quickly as I notice that it's gone. And that I don't let my ego get in the way of that, or I don't ever let my feelings of logic get in the way. Like this idea that there is like justice, which overrides affect rapport, is precisely one of the things that we would go on to understand in the rest of the thread that like destroys these societies.
Right.
Because there can be no justice if it comes at the cost of my rapport with my child. Like it comes at the cost of our ability to communicate transparently with each other, because obviously that would be the least just thing possible. Like that is the worst outcome. And so I think there needs to be a realignment of values where like affect rapport becomes the highest value with the child. And it goes above justice, and it goes above rightness, and it goes above wrongness, and it goes above like logic and ideas of property rights and ideas of danger, even, all sorts of things. And then like after that, you put all of the good Western values that like you have to have in order to live in society, in order to like, stay safe and all this stuff. So there's at least that. And then there's a secondary question of like, well, how do you establish that affect rapport? Like, what are some tactics or strategies? I think tactile touch and tactile talk seems way more important than I maybe would have given it credit for when I was younger. And that makes me think like I should have a lot, like my child should be like laying on my chest a lot, literally. And like, I should be looking into my kid's eyes. My kid should be looking into my eyes or wherever my kid wants to look. And I should just be like watching my child look at the world. And I should be giving like tiny little signals with my hand when I care to be subtle and playful, or like bouncing my kid around and throwing my kid and giggling with my kid and stuff when I want to be like loud and playful. That there's kind of this always, they use the word sensual, which I think maybe is more freaky to a Western audience.
Right.
But like sensual, I think really is a way of saying like hyper nuanced, like hyper fixated on tiny details, high bandwidth. Well, yeah, exactly. So it's like kind of always noticing that my child is noticing me, and not ever forgetting, not ever losing touch with the fact that my child's always noticing me. And so always kind of being in that noticing with the child, I think is one of the main tactics. And, if you want to go even further and say, well, what's a tactic for that? For noticing your child's noticing of you. Maybe like Alexander technique is a good thing to practice, and meditation awareness practice is pretty good. Also just like not being on your phone is pretty
Right,
cool.
right. Yeah. I mean, this is awesome. There's some really tactical stuff in there. And maybe you can reach out to Andrew about what you've learned as a parent, or if you've got more questions as a parent to be. I think Priya, your wife, is running some cool thing in New York, right? For future parents or existing parents or people who just want to like hang
Yeah,
out with babies.
exactly. Yeah, just
Yeah.
trying to like familiarize people with babies and the concept of babies and what babies are and stuff like that.
Nice. Well, yeah, I think this would be very powerful if all of this changed, if that became the top of the stack of important things to maintain that like field. A lot of communities could change, be massively impacted. I'm sure that baseline is at the center of like thriving communities and happy humans. So thanks for, yeah, jumping on, Andrew. I'll see you next week and we'll have another discussion about probably moving out of this, what we called like the inner circle of concentric circles. We'll probably
Yeah.
move into another outer layer of that concentric circle into how to prepare the environment. Like what books should be on the walls, what kind of materials should be around, what art, should there be mirrors, is there music, all these kinds of questions of the external environment. So get prepped for that next week. And thanks for tuning in.